At 7:12 a.m., the maintenance bay at Coastal Aeroworks buzzed with salt spray and noise. Technicians clustered for the morning brief. Mark Dalton, 41, a single dad and mechanic, stood silently at the back. CEO Clare Whitmore, 39, arrived grimly with her team. She declared disciplinary action for a critical failure. Mark's name echoed across the floor. The accusation was fast and unexplained. He was ordered to remove his ID badge immediately. His 9-year-old son, Eli, waited just outside the perimeter fence. Mark quietly bowed his head, accepting his termination. No one realized the sky was already changing. Mark Dalton was the definition of routine. He worked the early shift, arriving before dawn to ensure he had enough buffer time to drop Eli off at school before the morning bell rang. His life revolved around efficiency and predictability, not because he was dull, but because single fatherhood demanded absolute discipline. He was a quiet presence in the maintenance bay, known for the meticulous precision of his work and his absolute scarcity of small talk. In 4 years, he had never caused a single operational hiccup. The previous afternoon, however, a minor anomaly had occurred, a sensor fault in the critical fuel flow control system of the flagship prototype, the Manta X. Mark had been the first to spot the telemetry reading and, after a quick manual inspection, had written a concise technical report warning that the fault was likely symptomatic of a physical component nearing its stress limit, not just a software glitch. He had submitted the report through the proper channels. No one, from his immediate supervisor up to the executive floor, had acknowledged it. CEO Clare Whitmore didn't run a company. She ran a high-speed machine geared toward investor appeasement. With the Manta X's crucial test flight scheduled for 9 a.m., the last thing she needed was bad press or nervous shareholders. The test flight delay had already cost them significantly. She needed a quick, clean scapegoat, and Mark's unacknowledged report made him an easy target. He was a contractor, a low-cost, disposable asset with no internal political clout. The decision to fire him was made in a 5-minute emergency meeting, designed to project an image of swift, uncompromising accountability. The humiliation of the public dismissal in front of dozens of colleagues was intentional. A warning. Mark Dalton, Claire's voice cut the morning air, amplified by the portable PA system. Your failure to adequately secure the primary pressure monitoring system has resulted in a critical flight delay and a loss of confidence. As of this moment, your contract is terminated due to gross professional negligence. Mark simply stood taller, his eyes focused on a distant point beyond the CEO's shoulder. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue the fact that the sensor was merely reporting a systemic issue, or that he had specifically warned the system was operating under false stability. He accepted the digital printout of his termination papers, signing the document on the hood of a service truck, his hand steady. I only request 5 minutes to collect my personal tools from Bay 4, Mark said, his voice calm and level. Claire gave a curt, impatient nod. 5 minutes, then security will escort you off the premises. As he walked toward the hangar, he saw Eli, his son, waiting patiently by the chain-link fence, clutching a school bag. Mark gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible hand gesture, a quick thumb up, the universal signal between them that everything was, contrary to appearances, fine. His colleagues avoided his gaze, shuffling their feet or suddenly finding something critically important to examine on the nearest aircraft landing gear. They pitied him, or perhaps they were just relieved it wasn't them. Institutional loyalty, he thought, was a fragile thing, built on fear, not shared respect. Mark finished packing his ancient steel toolbox, checking each wrench and caliper one last time. He walked back, the heavy box feeling significantly lighter than the sudden, enormous weight of unemployment. He passed the guard station and walked through the gate. Eli immediately fell into step beside him. Ba oi, minve ha, Eli asked quietly, translating to, Dad, are we going home now? Mark paused, the metallic taste of the sea air strong in his mouth. He placed his heavy hand on his son's small shoulder, gazing back at the colossal hangar, where the Manta X prototype sat gleaming under the morning sun. He knew with a certainty that transcended the error logs that the system was still degrading. The clock was ticking. Mark stared intently at the runway, silent and unmoving for a long moment. He felt the pull of the work, the urge to fix, but the gate was closed. He had done his part. Mark and Eli found a park bench near the local transit stop, close enough to the airfield to hear the distant industrial sounds, but far enough to be anonymous. Mark called Eli's school, arranging for a late drop-off, simply citing an unexpected delay. His phone began to vibrate, receiving a flurry of texts from a few sympathetic junior colleagues. "Sorry, Mark. We know it wasn't you." Chen just confirmed the sensor flagged green again. Then abruptly the messages stopped. The corporate silence had been reimposed, heavier and more complete than before. Back inside Coastal Aeroworks, the senior engineering team had moved past the firing incident, focusing grimly on the Manta X. The atmosphere was thick with mounting dread. The new lead mechanic, hastily promoted from the junior ranks, began the final pre-flight checks. That's when the real symptoms began. The fuel gauge indicator for auxiliary tank B started flickering violently. Simultaneously, the digital pressure readout began a subtle, rhythmic oscillation. Up, then down, then up again. A slight, nervous tremor in the system's stability that grew with every cycle. The main system alarm, designed to be deafening, only gave a weak, shattering chirp, indicating that even the fail-safe software was struggling to execute properly. Clare Whitmore, now receiving urgent, hushed calls from the control tower, rushed back onto the maintenance floor. Her composed CEO facade was rapidly cracking under the reality of the escalating crisis. The engineers, highly specialized in avionics software, were instantly divided and shouting over each other. "It's a transducer fault. We need to cycle the entire fuel load and re-baseline the pressure matrix," shouted one senior engineer, already pulling up the disastrous, time-consuming standard operating procedure. This action alone would delay the flight for days. "No, look at the oscillation. It's a pump rhythm issue. It's going to overload the main line at peak thrust," countered Dr. Kim, the head of telemetry, her voice tight with panic. "We need to run the diagnostic sequence again. Check the firmware." They were debating complex digital solutions, unable to grasp the simple, mechanical truth Mark had already identified. They argued over lines of code and diagnostic streams, completely ignoring the physical reality of the machine groaning under pressure. The clock, a bright red countdown displayed on the hangar wall, began its final, high-pressure sequence. 37 minutes until the scheduled test flight. The pressure oscillation, the exact systemic instability Mark had warned about, was now a visible, physical indicator of impending catastrophe. The sound of the aircraft was starting to change too, a faint, high-pitched whine that should not have been there. Mark, still sitting on the bench, checked his watch. The time aligned perfectly with the moment he had predicted the faulty component would reach its thermal peak, forcing the pressure valve to fight desperately for stability. He knew exactly what was happening. The valve responsible for the fuel pressure return was physically compromised, a tiny sliver of metal warping under heat stress. The digital system was trying, and catastrophically failing, to compensate for a mechanical failure that required a simple wrench, not a code patch. He stood up suddenly, his expression resolute. "I have to go back. If that valve fails during takeoff, the resulting fuel surge will either flame out the engine or cause an explosion." He walked briskly back towards the perimeter gate, Eli running to keep up, clutching his father's hand. Mark approached the uniformed security guard, a man named Bob who was always grumpy and rigid, adhering strictly to the rulebook. "Bob, I need to get back in. Now, it's the return valve on fuel bank B. That flight is going to be grounded, or worse." Bob put his hand up, blocking the gate, his face impassive. "Mr. Dalton, your credentials are revoked. You are terminated. You cannot re-enter the facility. That is company policy." Mark tried to explain, urgently pointing toward the prototype. "That plane has an impending pressure failure in the B fuel manifold. It's not a software bug, it's a physical flaw. I know exactly how to fix it. It's a quick mechanical adjustment. Just let me tell the engineers." "I'm sorry, sir. Procedures are procedures," Bob repeated, his gaze fixed on the middle distance, utterly unwilling to take personal responsibility for overriding protocol. "Kuang Yen Liu Bi," Mark repeated slowly, his voice strained with desperation. It was a final, desperate plea, the critical information locked outside the gates of rigid, unthinking procedure. Fuel, baby. Eli tugged hard at his father's jacket, his young face anxious and tearful. Banoi Jung Ma, he whispered. But Dad, you're right. Why won't they listen? Mark looked down at his son, then back at the towering hangar, now shimmering slightly from the heat and the urgency within. He felt the cold weight of institutional deafness. He had been rejected twice, once by the CEO's authority and now by a gate guard's immovable procedure. He felt a profound sense of failure, not for himself, but for the aircraft and the pilots inside. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the drone of the distant airport traffic, a deep, rhythmic, heavy, thwumping sound. It wasn't a commercial jet. It was too low, too heavy, too insistent. It was the sound of powerful, low-altitude rotor blades beating the air with overwhelming, raw force. The sound grew rapidly louder, vibrating in the ground beneath their feet, signaling the arrival of something big, something serious, and something devastatingly unscheduled. The noise was directly overhead, forcing the security guard, Bob, to instinctively look up in alarm, momentarily forgetting his precious rules. The air began to vibrate, and the light momentarily dimmed. The beating sound materialized into a massive gray military asset, a U.S. Navy Seahawk utility helicopter, heavy and imposing. This was not the sleek, commercial tech Coastal Aeroworks typically serviced. It was built for war, its rotors spinning with intimidating, deafening power. The Seahawk didn't land on the designated commercial helipad. It descended violently and rapidly directly onto the asphalt maintenance apron, dangerously close to the Manta X prototype. The resulting downwash of air kicked up a violent, blinding storm of sand, oil, and debris, coating the delicate fuselage of the prototype and forcing the engineers inside the bay to shield their faces. The air stank suddenly of jet fuel and sea brine. All activity around the Manta X ceased. Every head, from the youngest intern to CEO Clare Whitmore, snapped upward in shock. Freeze moment. The helicopter settled, the whine of its turbines slowly decreasing, but the rotors continued their heavy, intimidating rotation, creating a high-decibel wash of sound. The side hatch slid open with a metallic thunk. A towering Navy lieutenant commander in crisp khaki flight gear, polished boots and dark, non-reflective sunglasses, jumped down, striding with singular purpose through the dust cloud. His presence radiated authority, his voice, trained to cut through engine noise and amplified by the lingering rotor din, cut through the momentary silence of the stunned crowd. "We are looking for Mr. Mark Dalton. We require immediate support. This is a Code Alpha situation." The entire maintenance bay, which seconds ago had been a frantic hive of civilian panic, went completely silent, save for the chopper's wind down. Every eye was now fixed on the gate, then on the CEO, then back to the officer. Clare Whitmore, who had just been aggressively coordinating the chaotic crisis, spun around. Her carefully applied makeup suddenly looked brittle, and her face was instantly drained of color. She looked utterly lost, her authority evaporating in the presence of true military urgency. The officer ignored the management team, marching straight toward the hangar entrance. He flashed his identification rapidly to a dumbfounded mid-level manager. His voice was firm, official, and left no room for debate. "This is a Priority 1 alert. We received an unconfirmed but highly credible advisory regarding a systemic vulnerability in the Series 5 fuel manifold architecture, potentially affecting naval assets in the Pacific Fleet. We need the source of the advisory, and we need him now." Twist 1. The Navy expert. Mark Dalton, having heard his name, calmly walked back toward the still-open gate, leaving a wide-eyed Eli standing safely behind the fence. The security guard, Bob, looked between Mark, the enormous military machine, and the high-ranking officer, his procedural programming utterly overridden by the sheer, undeniable authority of the U.S. Navy. His hand fell away from the gate. Mark stepped onto the apron, raising his hand to the lieutenant commander, his body language confident and familiar with command structure. "I'm Mark Dalton. I filed the advisory." The officer did not display surprise. He executed a sharp, formal salute, a sign of respect for a peer, not a civilian contractor. "Commander Harris, Naval Air Systems, Your analysis was cross-referenced and confirmed moments ago. The cyclical pressure variance you reported has been observed on two of our high-altitude assets, leading to near-critical fuel starvation at 20,000 feet. We have been scrambling resources. We need to know your exact diagnostic methodology right now. Twist 2. The original designer. Clare Whitmore finally found her voice. A strained, thin sound, barely a whisper against the mechanical hum. Dalton? You. You are a contractor, a level 1 mechanic. How could your analysis reach Naval Air Systems priority status? This is impossible. Commander Harris turned his full attention to the CEO, his expression unreadable behind his sunglasses, but his tone cutting and dismissive. Ma'am, with respect, Mr. Dalton is not just a mechanic. He is a former naval aviation safety assurance expert with top-level security clearances. More importantly, we confirm Mr. Dalton was the lead engineering consultant for the original Series 5 fuel system design team a decade ago. He didn't just service the system, he designed the intricate mechanical fail-safe mechanism that is currently fighting and losing to a thermal warp. He paused, letting the statement hang in the dusty air. We trusted his warning because he built the bomb. The realization hit Clare and the senior engineers like a physical blow. Mark hadn't just read the manual, he had written the book on this very system, knowing the obscure physical weaknesses that even the digital logs were programmed to ignore. His original warning, dismissed as a low-level anomaly by the corporate structure, had been escalated through a secure, high-level military contact Mark had retained specifically for critical safety warnings involving that legacy system. His loyalty was to safety, not to Coastal AeroWorks' balance sheet. Mark completely ignored the shock, the shame, and the confusion of his former employer and colleagues. He faced Commander Harris, focused solely on the technical problem. What is the exact frequency of the pressure oscillation you're seeing on your assets, Commander? It cycles precisely at 4.2 seconds with a 0.3 psi variance. The commander rattled off instantly, understanding Mark was the true authority now. Mark nodded, matching the Navy's data to the Coastal AeroWorks Manta X prototype, which was running a slightly newer control software, but the same valve. It's the bypass valve solenoid on the return line. It's overheating and distorting the housing ever so slightly, creating a micro leak that the pressure regulator is overcompensating for with that 4.2-second cycle. It won't log a fault until the pump runs dry. You have maybe 15 minutes before the thermal stress causes a complete mechanical lock, which is catastrophic fuel starvation. He walked straight toward the Manta X's fuel access panel, ignoring the flustered engineers who now parted respectfully for him. Clare, speechless and visibly trembling, watched as Mark reached into his small steel toolbox, now resting on the maintenance apron. He pulled out two specialized thin-gauge wrenches, tools he had meticulously maintained. I need one technician to stabilize the main pressure input, Mark ordered, his voice suddenly shifting from passive father to authoritative expert. Dr. Kim, you're on the monitor. Lock the regulator at 60 psi and hold it there manually. Dr. Kim, the head of telemetry who had been arguing for complex software solutions, was stunned, but recognized the clarity and immediate necessity of the command. She scrambled to comply, her hands flying across the console. Mark reached deep into the tight workings of the fuel bay. He located the pressure return valve, the tiny critical component everyone had overlooked in favor of the complex digital systems. He worked with speed and minimal motion. He applied one wrench to hold the component steady, and with the other performed a fractional, precise adjustment to the valve's mounting bolt, relieving the microscopic thermal strain on the housing. The micro-mechanical operation took less than 60 seconds of focused analog skill. The result was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Kim's voice, sharp with relief and sudden, overwhelming gratitude, cut through the tense air. Pressure is rock steady. Oscillation eliminated. The primary fault lights are clearing across the board. The high-pitched whine from the engine died instantly. The danger was neutralized. The multi-billion-dollar aircraft was safe. The Navy's warning was validated. Commander Harris stepped forward, giving Mark another sharp salute, his eyes full of respect. That was a critical save, Mr. Dalton. Thank you for your service to the fleet. Past and present. Mark returned the salute with the easy grace of a man who had earned it, the formal gesture feeling alien, yet perfectly right for the humble mechanic standing in the dusty maintenance bay. The crisis was over, the silence now settling over the apron, broken only by the decreasing whine of the Navy helicopter's engines as the pilot prepared for departure. The immediate pressure gone, the collective shame and realization of the management team was palpable. Claire Whitmore walked slowly across the apron, her tailored suit covered in a fine layer of dust, her expression one of utter humility and defeat. She stopped directly in front of Mark Dalton, and in a voice clear enough for the remaining technicians to hear, she issued the only possible statement. "Mark," she began, dropping the formal, "Mr. Dalton." Her voice was thick with emotion. "I was profoundly wrong. I ignored your report because I prioritized institutional procedure over expertise, and because I needed a fast answer to cover a larger institutional failure. I apologize publicly and completely. Your immediate action saved this program, saved our reputation, and potentially saved the lives of service members flying our legacy systems." She then extended her hand, not for a handshake, but with a formal offer of reinstatement. "I want you back immediately. We are creating a new role for you, Chief Safety Assurance and Critical Systems Consultant. It's an executive function. You will report directly to me, and you will have full authority to shut down any flight you deem unsafe." Mark looked at the proffered hand and shook his head gently. "I appreciate the recognition, Miss Whitmore, but I won't accept a high-level executive title. I will accept a role as a consultant. My expertise is on the floor, solving physical problems, not in the boardroom generating reports." He laid out his non-negotiable terms, his voice firm and unwavering. "I will serve as the advisory safety consultant. My role is to flag physical and mechanical vulnerabilities that evade the digital logs. And every single warning I flag, regardless of how minor it appears, must receive a thorough, documented review from an independent committee within 1 hour." "Agreed," Claire said instantly, desperate to regain his trust. "My second condition is non-negotiable. I maintain flexible hours and guaranteed time off. Eli's needs come before Coastal Aero works. If I need to leave for his school function, my clock stops, not the deadline. If my family needs me, I leave. No discussion, no penalty." Claire, remembering her own ruthless, rigid schedule that had blinded her to Mark's competence, softened visibly. "Consider it done. Your schedule is yours, Mark. That is a management priority." As Mark and Claire formalized the agreement with a brief nod, the technicians who minutes ago had snickered at his dismissal broke into spontaneous, respectful applause. It wasn't loud or ecstatic. It was a slow, steady, genuine affirmation. They were applauding the right man being right, and the rigid, toxic system finally being acknowledged and challenged. Commander Harris, his mission complete, gave a final, sharp nod of respect from the cockpit. He climbed back into the Seahawk, the heavy rotors beginning to spin up to full power. As the massive helicopter lifted off the apron, the rush of air was cleaner this time, carrying away the dust and the toxic atmosphere of the crisis. Claire watched it go, then turned back to Mark, her head still bowed deeply, a gesture of respect far more profound than any executive title. Mark simply squeezed Eli's hand, his own feeling steady and warm. He was home free, with his honor restored, his terms met, and his son looking up at him with unreserved, blazing pride. The maintenance bay quickly returned to stable operation. The Manta X was cleared for its next test flight, running flawlessly. Mark Dalton began his new role as advisory safety consultant, but his day-to-day work remained largely unchanged. He was still a presence on the floor, still working with his tools. But now when he spoke, the room fell silent. He insisted on working flexible hours, ensuring he was present for Eli's school pickups and parent-teacher meetings. His office was not the corner suite, but a simple, glass-walled observation station near the hangar entrance, allowing him to monitor the physical environment. At school, Eli often boasted to his classmates, "My dad saved a Navy plane today." Mark would simply smile when he heard this. "I just listened a little closer to the machine, Pumpkin. I just heard the machine telling me where it was hurting." He often repeated the core lesson. The key to solving complex problems is not always better technology, but better, more focused listening. Clare Whitmore, the CEO, underwent a profound operational conversion. The culture of expediency and scapegoating began to erode. Technical reports were no longer glanced at, they were studied. She institutionalized a physical layer review committee, directly answering to Mark, ensuring that all low-level, non-logged anomalies were investigated seriously and immediately. She learned to lead by seeking out the quietest, most expert voice in the room, rather than the loudest or the most compliant. Her obsession shifted from investor appeasement to absolute operational integrity. Mark didn't need the executive title for respect. He had earned that when he ignored the firing and returned to save the aircraft. His authority was now innate. A week after the incident, John, the operations manager who had backed Claire's decision to fire him, approached Mark near the clock-out station. He looked deeply ashamed. "Mark, I should have read your report. I apologize. We all failed you." Mark simply offered a firm handshake, holding no grudge. "We all miss what we aren't trained to see, John. It's a good lesson for us all to remember that procedures only work if they protect the people who know the most." As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the airfield, painting the runway golden orange, Mark secured his toolbox for the day. He collected Eli from the gate, the boy now carrying a small plastic toy jet he had been given by a grateful technician. Mark and Eli walking away from the colossal AeroWorks facility, their backs straight, their figures silhouetted against the bright, receding light. Mark's true value, his expertise, his integrity, and his unwavering commitment to his son could not be contained or invalidated by any corporate structure. The closing message: true expertise always carries its own authority, regardless of the title on the badge. Never let the procedure drown out the truth. The single-minded pursuit of safety is the highest form of leadership. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Kind Single Father.